Good morning. My name is Nick Robbins, Professor of Sustainable Finance at Economics, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar co-hosted by the LSE and UK Finance to launch our new report, Financing Climate Action with Positive Social Impact. This report looks at how UK banking and finance can support a just transition to a net zero and resilient economy. Today we'll hear about why this is so critical, particularly in the context of the coronavirus crisis. Before we get to the substance, I'd like to thank all of those who've made this possible, as this is a report which is a product of many hands. It's written by myself, Sophia Tickell, and Will Owen at the Grantham Research Institute, together with Andrew Sudmont at the University of Leeds. The Banking on the Just Transition project itself has been generously funded by HSBC, and it's been delivered in partnership with UK Finance. It's also headed by an expert advisory group, and I'd really like to thank all of those who've made this possible. The project builds on a collaborative research and dialogue process across the country, with events in Belfast, in Birmingham, in Cardiff, in Cornwall, in Edinburgh, and in Leeds. And we look at all parts of the banking landscape with a particular focus on financing a just transition for two priorities, for the SME sector and for housing. And we'll be releasing next week deep dive briefings on these two priorities, SMEs and housing. Now to today's event. We have a great lineup of speakers, and you will all have opportunities to ask questions, and there'll be a Q&A session. So please type your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll try and answer as many of those as possible. So, in terms of the agenda, we'll hear first from Bob Wigley, who is Chair of UK Finance, then Sophia Tickell, author of the report and Strategic Advisor on Banking on a Just Transition, will present the findings and recommendations. Then we hear from Theresa Graham, who is Chair of the UK Finance SME Advisory Board, and Ria Marie Thomas, Chief Executive Officer of the Green Finance Institute, will be the last speaker. And then we'll have a panel discussion and Q&A. So, Bob, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you to kick off proceedings. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this launch event for our report. My name is Bob Wigley. I'm Chair of UK Finance. When we were first approached by the Grantham Institute and Leeds University to partner with them, we had little hesitation in offering to assist. This report, which outlines how our industry and government can help to build our economy in a sustainable way and deliver a just transition to a net zero UK economy, spoke to our values and our ambition to get the industry and businesses to put sustainability at the heart of their operations. It was agreed at an early stage that consultation on the report would best take the form of a structured dialogue, and that this should be conducted the length and the breadth of the UK. So with assistance from the Place-Based Climate Action Network, 250 policymakers, financiers, businesses, trade unions, civil society and researchers, we've all participated in roundtables held in Belfast, Birmingham, Bristol, Cardiff, Cornwall, Edinburgh, Leeds and London. Little did we know, even as the last of these roundtables was held at the start of the year, that we would be facing the economic and financial situation that the world is currently experiencing. But our current situation doesn't change our conclusion. In fact, I would say it's more timely than ever, as our country can now build back better with sustainability in mind. In the short term, our industry must continue to focus on supporting economic recovery. And the industry has given unprecedented support both to businesses and to consumers and households in recent months to help those affected by COVID-19. For customers, UK Finance members have offered over 27 million interest-free overdrafts, provided almost 1 million payment deferrals on credit cards and over 600,000 payment deferrals on personal loans. Additionally, 1.9 million mortgage payment deferrals have been provided to borrowers, the equivalent of 1 in 6 current mortgages. Over 1 million businesses have been supported through the 3 government-backed coronavirus lending schemes, in addition to other forms of support such as working capital extensions, overdraft extensions and capital repayment deferrals. But as our economy now starts to recover, and we find ourselves entering this period of new normal, we need to think about how we put climate change into our longer-term recovery measures. There is much opportunity for these growth measures to be aligned not only to the net zero target, but also for this to be approached in a fair, just and inclusive way. Just transition is the idea that we look to build in a place-based way whilst considering the societal aspect of climate change, being conscious of both individual and business needs. It's an idea which also ties in closely with the government's levelling up agenda here in the UK, a sentiment echoed by Europe, with the Commission having stated renewable energy and the circular economy will be part of the proposed recovery package for the continent. Achieving the net zero target by 2050 is difficult but critical, and the banking and finance sector will be crucial to making the transition a reality. Change must begin with leadership. Board members must take climate change seriously and incorporate the just transition into their institutional strategy and culture, embedding it as a key purpose for their organisations and implementing a clear action plan for how banks can operationalise just transition. Accountability will be more important than ever, with some measures already in place, such as guidance on sustainability reporting, but added pressure on corporate responsibility and the FCA proposals for enhanced climate disclosures by premium listed companies. But even more can be done. According to our fellow researchers from the London School of Economics and SOAS, University of London, only 5 of the 170 central banking and supervisory responses to the COVID-19 crisis explicitly take sustainability into account, though this may be a matter of timing, as obviously their first priority has been to deal with the immediate crisis. In any event, this can be used as an opportune moment. The response to COVID-19 has taught us that we can adapt business practice and service delivery in support of the economy and society in a way and to a timescale not previously thought imaginable. If we do this effectively, there is a real opportunity for lasting progress. And this report outlines some initial actions that can be taken at a local, regional and national level to support these aims. The purpose of banking is to support the real economy over the long term. Banks and building societies are already regarding climate change action as a priority, and some are already starting to align their business goals with net zero targets. We must now scale up these efforts to make the economy more resilient so that our industry and the government can ensure a speedy and effective recovery in the short term, ensuring a sustainable economy and a sustainable planet for the future. Thanks.
Bob, well, thanks so much for those opening words. I think you really helped to set this in the context of the country in terms of climate action and levelling up. I'm really glad you made that point about leadership. And to those of you on this call, one of the things that UK Finance has done in response to the report is actually collate a series of statements of support from 8 CEOs from the banking sector. So I think that question of leadership. And then I think you pointed to this question of opportunity now to build back better as we go forward with climate action and the just transition. Thank you so much, Bob. Sophia, if I could turn to you now, really to give the key findings, key messages and key recommendations of the report. Sophia, over to you. Thank you.
Sophia, I think you're still on mute.
You're on mute.
I beg your pardon. So very good to see everybody, and thank you so much. I'm about to present the findings of this very consultative process that Nick and Bob have both talked about. So it's a very collaborative findings that we are going to be talking about today. The key differentiator of our report and other pieces of work that are coming out at the moment is our focus on finance and on the banking sector in particular. And that is what you'll hear in what's about to come. So the headlines of what we have found in our work is, first of all, that the just transition is absolutely critical for climate success as a whole. COVID-19 has pointed to the need for a just and a green recovery in the way that it has highlighted some of the inequalities and the precarious working. So a just transition is absolutely critical for climate. What we have found is that means it needs to be inclusive, it needs to be place-based, so it needs to look at the different regions and areas of the country, and it needs to be specific to different sectors. Financial institutions will be absolutely essential, and banks in particular, as we're going to look at. We have found everybody that we've spoken to has said how helpful and important a local and national policy roadmap will be. It will set a level playing field. It will give clarity for the business sector. And then finally, the final headline is that we have this incredible momentum for action. Just transition, which was not a very familiar term recently, is now on everybody's lips, and thinking about how that works and what it means for UK's leadership, both at COP26 and domestically, there's a huge opportunity here, which we feel is important to take. So just transition as the next chapter in climate action, really. So we feel that we've gone from confronting climate risks and really taking on board what they mean and what that means in terms of how we need to respond, looking at the green opportunity, identifying the need to really think about resilience and what does actually resilience mean in terms of prevention and protection. And then now we've got to the social dimension, and that basically it means that it is absolutely essential that people believe that the transition to a net zero economy is going to be good for them individually, or at the very least that their interests are going to be taken into consideration and some sort of mitigation is going to be put in place to prevent people from suffering. So the strategic imperative, we've identified these 5 things as what we mean by just transition. So first is that it will need to maximise the social benefits of the transition. So it started with green jobs. First of all, just transition tended to talk about jobs, and it now has extended out to other socioeconomic variables, but jobs are still a very important part of it. We need to mitigate the social risks, and that means making sure that workers and communities are not stranded in the way that they have been in previous large industrial upheavals. We need to empower those who are affected by change, so that and that means making sure that they're consulted and they participate in key decisions that are taken locally and nationally. We need to anticipate future risks to address issues up front. So we need to plan, for example, for economy-wise reskilling. And we do in the report look at the impact on jobs and the jobs that are going to be affected. And there is more detail there about how we think that might be done. And then it's going to be vital to mobilise investments from both public and private sectors. And I'll come on to that a little bit more shortly. So what do we mean by inclusive, place-based and sector-specific? So in inclusive, what we've done is identify within the work 5 different stakeholders who will be affected by the transition and who will need to be consulted. So we've got workers, we've got communities, we've got consumers and citizens, and the report goes into a little bit more detail about small businesses, which, as has already been mentioned, have been so badly affected by the COVID crisis. So we've looked specifically at how that might work. Place-based, the UK economy is incredibly unequal, and if we are to have a just transition, we really need to make sure that we drive this goal of levelling up the economic and social prospects of all the different regions in the country. And by sector specific, it is very clear that different sectors of the economy will be affected differently by the transition. And we need to plan for that, and we need to respond to that in a way that actually is differentiated. So why banks? What's the strategic rationale for them to take action? Well, first of all, it's a matter of principle. Banks have this absolutely critical role in serving the real economy, and therefore it is very important that they come to this in acknowledgement of the fact that it's kind of the right thing to do. We know that the sector was very badly hit as a result of the financial crisis, and rebuilding trust is taking time. We think that there's a huge opportunity here for that trust to be accelerated if the banking sector can be seen to be flexible enough to respond to the needs of the just transition. The expectations of bank stakeholders are changing quite significantly. ranging from institutional investors on one hand who are saying that they would like to see bank leadership in terms of the just transition, to the communities who banks serve, all the way through policymakers, customers and regulators. And we'll come back to the regulator shortly, just thinking about what regulators might be doing. We think it's material for banks. It provides a really significant, better way of understanding climate risk if you think about the just transition in terms of your strategy and how it might affect the long-term business. And then finally, in terms of opportunities, and I'll come back to this, there is a huge opportunity for responding to demand for different types of product with positive social and environmental impact. So what are we recommending? The report highlights 8 different recommendations for banks. And on leadership, we're basically saying that this needs to be owned both by the board and the executive leadership. And that combined body needs to be thinking about what it means for the purpose of the bank and what that means for the culture. And also we need an action plan, a strategy which actually helps people understand how it will be implemented. We think there's huge opportunity for banks to differentiate between customers. And by example, we have identified for small businesses, for SMEs, small and medium enterprises, that there are 3 different types of customers within that section that the banks can be thinking about. So there are those SMEs who provide green solutions, and we're suggesting that banks reduce the cost of funding to those SMEs who offer solutions, technologies and business models that are going to enable the transition to be made. And likewise, for green adopters, for those businesses who are adapting and adopting to the transition, we think that they could reduce the cost of finance there. There will be a number of SMEs who are transition exposed. So those are the SMEs who are in grey areas of the economy, who are going to need to move out of high carbon way of doing things. And we're saying that although the banks might be reducing the cost of funding for them, they need to do that in a way that ensures that there is reskilling and redeployment so that those people and those businesses don't lose out. I've talked a little bit about place, but again, we think that banks could be really thinking about regional needs. Banks have networks across the country, and despite the fact that there's been a withdrawal of some banking services and the closure of branches, there is still an enormous amount of knowledge held by the banks. And we think that there's a lot of creative work that could go on in the regions, and banks will be very essential to providing finance there. The banking sector has an extraordinarily powerful advocacy voice, and what we're hoping is that they will engage with policymakers to push for a just transition to help create that enabling environment. Banks can offer partnerships. There's an enormous amount of very interesting work on blended finance, so where you're looking at philanthropic, public and private finance coming together to solve some of the issues that are not possible to do in a purely commercial way. And we would like to see banks playing a very active role there. And finally, just because of the stakeholder interest that I mentioned earlier, it is in the bank's interest to report on their progress to this, and that would be in the annual report and accounts every year. But banks can do an enormous amount, but they can do much more if there is a very favourable policy environment. So we also identify 6 recommendations for policymakers. And these range from making a very firm commitment, which includes putting very clear sectoral plans for a just transition. We think that there's an opportunity for the COVID recovery to be dovetailed with the just transition and to target any stimulus packages and recovery plans to just transition. There's a huge role for public finance in its various forms, and we talk about the idea of a national investment bank with a sustainability mandate as part of the solution. Regulation, there's already the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulatory Authority are already thinking about what it is that the financial services industry should be doing about climate. And we would like to see the social dimension incorporated into some of that regulation. The government and policymakers can also play a very active and important role in place and thinking about the instruments and innovative ways of addressing place in and be partnership there. And specifically, local authorities are already doing a huge amount in this area, and we feel that there's local government and bank partnerships that would be very fruitful. And then finally, there is the international dimension. And I've mentioned COP26, but there are also the financial instruments of export and development finance that can be used to bring about the just transition. So, in summary, just transition is the next chapter of climate action. It's the right thing to do, necessary thing to do, and the smart thing to do. We think that the just transition can be kick-started through ambitious COVID recovery plans, but they need to happen now, and that is to make this commitment to this green and inclusive economy. Banks and other financial institutions will be crucial, and we look at the banking sector in the report. It's not just the high street banks. We're talking about other people who provide banking services and non-bank finance. The UK can be a global leader. It can bring together finance, climate action and an inclusive economy for COP26 and make a big splash there. And then just finally, our commitment, the authors of the report and the partners who have put together the project, we will be proposing the establishment of this Financing the Just Transition Alliance, because there's a huge amount of momentum that's built up through this work. And we hope to support multi-stakeholder innovation in all parts of the UK in the future as well. So this report in a way is a start, and we're very much looking forward to being part of what happens next. So thanks very much, Nick.
So I bang on time, and we're already getting a good lot of questions. So thanks for all of those that are coming in. Lots of really perceptive remarks and comments. So we'll come to those in the Q&A. I mean, and just on the point of the sort of COVID recovery, obviously we've had the Chancellor's plan for jobs, and it was really heartening to see the focus on green recovery with a particular focus on housing. And there are actually some of the stimulus measures that the Chancellor announced were particularly tailored so that more support would be provided for low-income households. So I'm sure we might pick up that in discussion, but we're seeing sort of first steps around that. So now I need to come to some responses from these and finance leaders on this. First of these, Theresa Graham, who, as I said before, chairs UK Finance's SME Advisory Board and be very involved in our work. Theresa, over to you for your thoughts and reflections on how we carry this forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you very much for inviting me today. And congratulations to the team who have developed this thought-provoking policy report. The UK Finance's SME Advisory Group, we act as critical friend to UK Finance, representing the voice of the SME policy initiatives that emerged throughout the organisation. We play a key role in providing a direct link to businesses, predominantly through their trade associations, on all access to finance issues, including the role of finance in supporting SMEs to move towards net zero. The group's keen to consider the report's recommendations and play a key role in suggesting ways to take this forward. And as the report says, understanding the entrepreneurial mindset and desire to contribute positively to local economies is key. So let's consider for a moment that SME DNA. They are dynamic, creative, innovative organizations. They're often over-dependent on a few employees doing everything operational, which often requires multitasking. They're usually focused on a limited number of products or services. They usually have simple structures allowing flexibility and agility, and they are often steeped in their local community. And we've seen this a great deal during lockdown. My favorite coffee is now from a small local pet shop, and I don't have any pets. And they never have enough time and are focused always on that phone ringing to hopefully receive that order that's going to be game-changing. And above all, many SMEs start at the survival stage of development and either fail or really never emerge from that stage. And those who often grow into amazingly powerful local, national, and global brands. But it's not always access to finance that holds them back. Access to knowledge and skills are equally important factors. Then on top of all the pain and hard work that goes into running an SME, we throw into a mix a pandemic, which requires many to lock down and move into borrowing mode for the third time. And we now appear to be on the way to re-entry, which is likely to be just as painful, particularly finding a way of avoiding too many redundancies. And for those requiring more excitement and who want something to look forward to, we'll add a sprinkle of Brexit uncertainty. So now we're asking SMEs to think climate change as well. And is that fair? Well, yes, it is actually. And now is the time to get them thinking and acting. Building back better is the ambition. We've seen a great deal of radical help from the Exchequer. Let's try and learn from that creativity to move SMEs along this necessary path, but with extreme care. In my experience, SMEs tend to act on the back of one of two things. The first, just as they're about to go over the cliff and the inevitability of sink or swim hits them. And the second is incentivizing them to do what's good for business or good for their business with an onward positive impact here for the environment. And it's the second aspect that will require some creativity around blending public finance with commercial lending and impact investment. So how could that work? Well, I also chair an award-winning company called Salix Finance, and we receive money from BEIS and onward provide interest-free loans to the public sector to invest in energy-saving schemes on their estate. Repayment of capital is from their ongoing savings in energy bills, and the payback period is currently up to 8 years with an average of 5. And although focused on the public sector, many organizations we deal with are small, in particular schools. And the smallest need a few things to help them along. They need an understanding of what technologies work best and how sustainable they are. There's no advantage to investing in green when greener is around the corner. And they need someone to look at the organization holistically to determine how a blend of technologies could make them the greenest they could ever be, and then to prioritize the implementation so as to get the best bang for limited bucks. And they need the project to be affordable. With Salix funds, after the capital is repaid, and we have 100% recovery of loans in 14 years of operation, the public sector gets to keep the savings in perpetuity to invest in frontline services. So could we provide grants, for example, to holistically review and assess the organization? Could we then lend in a similar way? Could we perhaps bring bounce-back loans and CBILS into play in respect of crediting repayments in a green way? Could we do this for non-borrowers too, to level the playing field? So it's not just the borrowers who benefit, perhaps via green tax credits. Or let's ask the British Business Bank to see how their products could be adapted to help with this just transition imperative. Could we jump on the back of existing schemes to modernize and re-energize them? I mean, take Investors in People, which was needed in my days to win government work and other large company work. Could we reinvent that by imbuing it with some green credentials so that the SME and the supply chain gets greener? And while I'm talking about government contracts, for years I have been asking for the big company bidders for these contracts to be assessed by government based on the strength of their SME supply chain and what help and guidance they provide them. Implement this policy and focus on greening up SMEs with the promise of good tender opportunities. And while we're at it, could we encourage, and yes, I agree local authorities are doing a lot, but could we encourage them more to align their green initiatives so that an SME in more than one local authority doesn't need to adapt its way of operating to suit differing and sometimes incongruent policies? I mean, take car sharing as an example. Two businesses wanting to share vehicles in two different local authority constituencies. Can they get parking permits for both constituencies? No. So there is an extra car now on the road that was avoidable. So these approaches would be especially relevant for all the happy non-borrowers that still exist despite COVID-19. So we need to devise something that demonstrates to the SME that becoming greener is not just affordable, but that it's good for sales, it's good for marketing, it's good for reputation. Above all, it's just good for business. So thank you for listening to me.
Teresa, what a fantastic set of ideas. Really fizzing with enthusiasm. I really like that, all the different ways in which we can take this forward. And a very practical example from Salix, you mentioned the BBB and their role in this, and many other areas of getting very practical, operational public finance, blended finance packages. So really good. And I like that comment you made at the end, actually making sure that, yes, it does need to be rooted in different parts of the country and needs to be place-based, but making sure that that is not leading to a sort of fragmentation of effort, which obviously, sort of, as you were saying, maybe could interfere with SMEs taking action. So really thanks for that. So our next speaker, Ria Marie Thomas, CEO of Green Finance Institute, a lot of work really driving financial innovation across the green finance agenda, and has done some great work around housing, but also in many other areas. Ria Marie, really good to get your thoughts. Your institute is driving forward green finance. How do you see sort of the just transition dimension sort of complementing the work that you're doing happening across the financial sector? Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Nick. It's always hard going last, isn't it? Especially when we've had so many good points made already. And here to all the very practical solutions that Teresa put forward. I also wanted to pick up on some of the points that Bob and Sophia made, in particular, Bob's point about the purpose of banking to support the real economy over the long term. That really does lend itself to this increasing realization that the green and the just transition does need to be very sectoral focused. That needs to be our approach to financing green. And I fully agree with Sophia's point about just transition being the next chapter of climate action. And I also wanted to pick up in particular about the points you made about the need for an investment bank with a sustainability mandate. I think over time, I'm reasonably confident the financial markets will evolve to integrate climate science into everyday decision making. But the climate science tells us we can't actually afford to wait. So that's why we need to start creating these mechanisms for generating viable alternative revenues for banks and for investors. I also believe we should be pricing carbon in line with the science. But in order to overcome some of those barriers to private investment, in the run-up to COP26 and support the aims of the Just Transition work, I really do believe, and I'm advocating strongly, for the need for us to redeploy some public balance sheet to seed an infrastructure bank for the UK. Not to compete with the existing commercial institutions at all, but with a mandate to create new financial markets for defined net zero economy outcomes by sector and by channeling global capital towards local solutions, points that have already been made really well. I just wanted, if I may, just to go into how I think such an investment bank could actually further the whole green finance agenda. I think in the first place, it could really address technology and early deployment risks, both through supporting individual transactions, but really importantly, by building familiarity within the financial sectors by financing multiple deals in new innovative areas. And there are plenty of areas that do remain new and innovative. We're looking at things like marine technology. We need to look at hydrogen and its various uses. And Nick, you mentioned housing, but there's also in industrial settings, in transport. And that's before we even start talking about carbon capture storage. So plenty of areas that are new, innovative, and yet unfamiliar sectors where an investment bank could actually really pump prime the market, as we've obviously seen with the success of the previous Green Investment Bank with offshore wind. The second would be addressing construction risk for large, complex projects that we know are less attractive to the private sector. The third around providing long-term finance and liquidity that is, again, very challenging for the private sector due to capital constraints, or, as is obviously very important at the moment, concerns about long-term economic conditions. The fourth area would be on financing projects where the case for social return is greater than a purely financial return. So examples would be projects that achieve welfare objectives like social housing, coastal defences, or an area of particular interest for the Green Finance Institute, which is retrofitting the building stock to achieve energy efficiency and low carbon heating. And finally, I think the new investment bank could play a role in aggregating projects and portfolios so that the bank could then develop innovative financing structures, securitization, collateralized loan type obligations, which could then mobilize institutional investment towards these smaller local projects and solutions that we've been hearing about this morning. I mentioned offshore wind, and I think it is quite an interesting case study, so I think it's worth elaborating on that just for a moment. The Green Investment Bank did overcome the investment gaps in building the offshore wind market in the UK, and for anyone that's unfamiliar with this statistic, 40% of global installed offshore wind capacity sits around the British coastline. So it really is a genuine success story and is now fully financed by institutional investment. But the Green Investment Bank, by overcoming those investment gaps, it did so in conjunction with other really significant measures that were put in place by the policymakers in order to rapidly develop that industry, specifically providing financial incentives in the form of contracts for difference, and that lowered the high investment hurdle rates faced by the project developers and the investors. They aligned the seabed leasing processes, a very technical point, with onshore leasing processes, and set up structured bidding rounds for access and for construction permissions, and also provided competitive bidding rounds to auction the available offshore wind capacity that highlighted the investment opportunity. So in summary, if we were to break down that case study into a potentially replicable blueprint, it involved identifying untapped high potential technologies, targeting barriers with specific policy instruments, indicating future market demand, in that particular case for offshore wind, and then providing key institutional support in the form of a dedicated investment institution, an investment bank with a sustainability mandate. I'm firmly of the view that we need that sort of top-down vision with the vehicles and the institutions, as well as the bottom-up initiatives to drive the transition, with that focus on local delivery. And if I may, Nick, I mean, this very much underpins our work at the Green Finance Institute. So we were launched almost a year ago with a mandate to accelerate the mobilization of finance towards a net zero and resilient economy. And we're executing that mandate very much by convening coalitions of experts to clearly set out the barriers to investing in real economy challenges, and then co-designing the innovative financial mechanisms, as well as the enabling policy, fiscal, regulatory, data and analytics tools that you then needed to bolster and amplify the success of those proposals. You mentioned our flagship program is our Coalition for the Energy Efficiency of Buildings. We know in the UK emissions from homes are responsible for 20% of our national greenhouse gas emissions, but it also, and this was very much emphasised by the Chancellor last week, and obviously we welcomed those announcements, that there is something like 65 billion of investment needed in order to upgrade 19 million inefficient homes. And research suggests that that could create 150,000 new jobs in order to meet those targets for our housing stock by 2035. So a real example, a live example of the just transition in action. I'll just quickly mention that we recently published our first report. We deliberately confined this conundrum in the first place of our work to the UK and to the residential housing stock, but even within that subsector, in order to deliver practical, actionable interventions, our coalition needs to focus on the different supply-demand dynamics, the financial decision makers, the risk and opportunities presented by the social rented, the private rented, and the owner-occupier sectors. So all our conclusions are available online, so I'm not going to repeat them here, but importantly, the coalition members proposed a portfolio of over 21 demonstration projects that have all been designed to overcome the barriers, and importantly, they have the ability to scale. And picking up on the points that some of the other speakers made, I do think that we've had a plethora of successful pilots and pathfinder projects in many key sectors in the UK over the years that really do highlight the ingenuity and creativity of financial services. We really do need to have a forensic look at how these pilots have been successful. Quite often they are down to the individual brilliance and tenacity of fantastic individuals or small groups, not the replicable model. So we need to look at what are those enabling conditions and really focus on how do we work really collaboratively, not just across the banking sector, but in conjunction with the policymakers, the academics, and the industry experts to find ways of quickly scaling up the things that work and sharing best practice on the mechanisms that enable us to channel capital. I'll leave that there, Nick. Looking forward to the questions.
Thanks so much, Marie. The focus on forensic towards the end shows that we've got to get very granular in this. And again, you focused a lot on two things. One on the offshore wind. I mean, the sort of the finance architecture of that. I think also we know that the offshore wind sector has a great potential for the just transition in terms of high quality jobs, jobs which have good working conditions, and work we've done in the past, looking particularly at Siemens, the wind factory that they've attached in Hull, shows the potential for not just sort of quantum of jobs, but very, very strong jobs and a good supply chain. A lot of focus there about actually looking at the gender base offshore wind sector to increase opportunities for women as well. So I think there's a case study of the just transition as well. You went a little bit, which was great, actually, about some of the characteristics of the new of a potential investment bank focused on infrastructure, which could complement the British Business Bank, which obviously is focusing on SMEs at the moment. And I say there's a good cluster of questions around this notion of sort of public finance, which, if I can throw back to the panel, I think sort of questions around what could be the difference between this National Investment Bank and what used to be the Green Investment Bank. We've had proposed yesterday, in fact, the UK 100, the idea of a development bank, which would be very much on the development process. Questions coming in from Midlands Energy Hub and HSBC. So Bob, maybe if I could start with you. You were actually involved in the Green Investment Bank Commission. Your reflections on the sort of what a national investment role it could play, and also what type of institution we might need in the sort of recapitalisation process coming out of this crisis, particularly in terms of the equity. Maybe if I could start with Bob on your thoughts on the sort of public finance institutions that we're going to need to take this forward.
Thank you. So it was very interesting listening to Marie because, as you mentioned, I chaired the Green Investment Bank Commission, which wrote the template on the basis of which the Green Investment Bank was established, and exactly the things that Marie listed were our focus. She mentioned pump priming. This is about governments doing things that only governments can do, which then crowd in private sector investment into projects which wouldn't otherwise occur because there is some kind of market failure which prevents them. Sorry to sort of get back to economics, but that's what it's all about. If we can use taxpayers' money, it has to be to do something which the private sector wouldn't otherwise do. It's about crowding in, not crowding out. And I think, I mean, there are varying views about the extent to which the Green Investment Bank was successful in that endeavour, but I think Marie listed some of its achievements. I think being a centre of excellence for new technology, determining which of those are going to be the winners, and helping crowd private sector investment into winning projects at scale around the country is what this body or institution should be aiming at. Now, if I can just change the subject slightly, you mentioned the work on recapitalisation. So UK Finance, as a trade association, is working closely with the City UK under the leadership of Adrian Montague, and we've been looking at what happens at the end of this first period of COVID as we start to see economic recovery, and some of the lending which occurred in the lead up to the crisis and then with government support through the crisis becomes challenging for SMEs and even larger companies to repay. And there's a report due actually in the next few days which will examine how we deal with that issue. Some of its findings are already public. The main one is that we think there's about 100 billion there will be about 100 billion of debt to industry, which will be, in inverted commas, unsustainable. And what we need is some mechanisms to help the economy, having got through this first phase, to carry on recovering during the next phase. Now, I think a couple of things in that context. We will be examining whether it is time for what we call a national recovery bank. I think we just need to be a little bit careful here, because what we don't want is a plethora of new institutions. So it may be that by combining expertise that already exists within government departments, within the task force that you're proposing to establish, within Rhiannon Marie's team, we can create a group of people who can bring together the expertise we need to make the policy changes and policy interventions that would crowd in private sector money. Whether we actually need a new institution or whether it can be done through existing institutions, I'm, to be honest, on the fence. But I definitely think I support completely Rhiannon Marie's view that we need a specialist group bringing in skills from the public sector, the private sector, policymakers, civil society, who can help bring the expertise to bear and make sure that market failures are addressed, so that we really push forward and address our targets for the just transition. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bob, and thanks for raising this other issue. And I think of a sort of recovery bank to deal with the sort of debt to equity dimension of it. One of the things which is interesting in the UK is we do have a national investment bank being developed in Scotland, the Scottish National Investment Bank. And interesting, as part of its mandate, it has a clear mission on helping Scotland to deliver its net zero transition, but also aligned with just transition principles. I think it shows an example of how these things can be integrated. If I may take a sort of another question, quite a lot of interest, a number of questions coming in around dealing with, I suppose, the SME sector, but also particular types of SME, social enterprises, community businesses, and so on. So I don't know, Sophia, how that might have kicked off, and maybe Teresa, you might want to sort of chip in on that, but particularly how we reach into sort of businesses that particularly have a social purpose and also are linked to the community.
Yeah, so the report covers this, and some we do look at this in the report, and it was very clear, particularly in our workshops, how much there is, different types of finance are going to be needed in different places for different types of institutions. And on our advisory committee and participating, we had some non-mainstream banks, because that was another question, Nick, that somebody was asking about, do we have critics of the finance and banking? And we had Triodos Bank, Abundance, Ecology, Unity, the Southwest Mutual. So we were trying to make sure that the people who were involved in the project did cover the alternative finance sector. And partly that was in recognition of the fact that CDFIs, community development financial institutions, can be incredibly important in identifying and funding organisations that mainstream banks might not be able to reach. So we call very strongly for diversity in the banking sector in the report, because you need to have a range of people who are able to meet the differing needs. Having said that, I think what we are also saying is that there is an opportunity for mainstream banks to partner more creatively, particularly in the regions, to make sure that social enterprises and others are getting the types of finance that they need. And that's so it may not be pure play commercial, but one of the things that is very evident, and to Teresa's earlier point about people need persuading that there are incentives, social enterprises and other small and medium enterprises, probably more than social enterprises, need to be persuaded that this is going to be in their interests to make this transition. And to do so, they will need advice about what it would actually mean in terms of how do you transition the business. Having run a small business as myself, it's not an easy thing to do, to suddenly change everything. So you need to know what needs to be done, and you need to know how it can be done, and you need support to both financially and in terms of practical ideas. So yeah, very important part of the piece, I think.
Teresa, anything to add for you, particularly sort of the sort of social dimension, or sort of businesses with a particular community linkage, and see, as Sophia was saying?
Yeah, yes. One of the other hats that I wear quite a few, Nick, but one of the other hats I wear is I actually run a social enterprise in northwest London. It's a cinema, so it's a closed cinema at the moment, but it 100% of its distributable profits go off to charity. So we run it as a ruthlessly commercial organization because I want to make lots and lots of money to give away. So I think one has to, make sure that one balances the mission of those social enterprises. They are we run on 50 volunteers, on like volunteer power. It is a massively great way of bringing the community together. Some of these local social enterprises are absolutely critically important to the social being of the community in which they're housed. Any way in which we could harness the ideas that are emerging from the report, trying to get resources, financial resources, to increase what is already there in the community and to help them to re-emerge, because they suffered greatly during lockdown, but others have thrived. And what I'm really impressed about are the reports that are coming out from people saying they're going to continue to shop locally. And I think that I think we need to make it easy for them and all SMEs to access the things that they need. The last thing we want to do, and I'm absolutely in favor of any organization or institution having a sustainability mission, or indeed products having a sustainability focus. I think what we need to do is to aggregate what is already out there and known to SMEs, rather than to try and create more and different bits of the marketplace that might seek simply to confuse. But I'm looking at, with a great deal of interest in the work that Bob was talking about in recapitalization and how much needed equity might flow to SMEs, but how we can work with SMEs to get them to welcome equity so as to create a step change in their activities. Because that is still not something, equity is still not something that is wholly welcomed by the SME community.
Great, thanks, Teresa. Now, to maybe pick on one of your points about sort of confusion of different approaches. I mean, I think that's been the way we've been looking at the just transition, in the sense that it's a way of taking forward and actually strengthening the approaches that banks and finance are addressing to many other parts of the agenda. We shouldn't see it as a separate just transition program. One of the things I think we mentioned is that we've also been looking at the housing sector. And I'd like to maybe spend a couple of minutes looking at this, if I may. Clearly, there are huge sort of social dimensions, just transition dimensions around housing on the sort of consumer side in terms of fuel poverty, social housing, and issues of that. There's an intrinsic social dimension there, and then also on the sort of supply chain side and the workforce side and so on. Bob, maybe if I could start with you, and then Marie, bring you in, because you've done work both with your coalition and also you've done some work particularly on the recovery plan. But Bob, maybe your first thoughts and reflection on how we get this right now. We really do need, at scale, get the housing and sort of the housing sector this time. Thank you.
So we know that, I think you quoted a statistic of a number of houses in the housing stock that are currently not yet green. And we know that it would be a relatively simple exercise to green those houses, and rather than produce more energy, save the energy that we're currently using inefficiently and wasting. And I think one of my regrets about the Green Investment Bank Commission's report is that we made a couple of very simple recommendations around the existing housing and indeed commercial property stock and how it could be green that weren't picked up by government. And here I think you do need a combination of incentive, so stick and carrot, it's both. And the proposal was very simple. We said, look, when you buy a house, you pay stamp duty. No one likes paying stamp duty. Why don't you introduce the idea that as you have to have an energy efficiency report when you buy a house these days, it lists the measures that you could take to make your house energy efficient. If you were to undertake those measures, you would get a slightly discounted stamp duty rate, or put it the other way around. If you didn't do it within 6 months, you would pay an additional stamp duty rate. This could be wrapped up in a scheme where the cost of the measures was added to the mortgage provided by the bank. They could be partners, as there were in the Green Deal, in the installation community. You would help undertake the measures. The whole thing could be wrapped up as a national scheme, providing a very clear incentive and stick for those who buying houses. And if you look at the churn of the housing stock, it wouldn't actually take many parliaments for much of that housing stock to be greened. And of course, you could do the same with commercial property. Again, when you take over a lease, you have an energy efficiency report. There, of course, you would have to do it through the council tax system or the business rate system. And again, have some kind of incentive, stick in the carrot. If you take the measures to green your property in accordance with the recommended measures, you get some kind of discount. If you don't, you get a penalty. I think these very simple measures, if picked up by the government, could make a massive difference over a period of 10 to 15 years. But Marie, you're sort of more up to date on this than I am, but that's one of my regrets of the recommendations that wasn't picked up from our report 10 years ago.
So, Marie, I think you mentioned you had sort of 21 demonstrator projects at different aspects of the energy efficiency dimension. I mean, what do you think about Bob's suggestion, and also maybe pick out some of your particular demonstrations that have a sort of strong sort of social dimension to them? Thanks.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think the point that Bob is making, which I'd like to reiterate, is sadly there is no green magic bullet for this sector or any of the other sectors. That we do need this. We've got 21 demonstrator projects in our main report, very much driven by the market. You know, to paraphrase the TCFD, by the market, for the market. We also produced 19 stimulus actions. We used to hear in the sliding scale that could be designed to be fiscally neutral for Treasury was put forward, but agreed that would then need to also come with the additional measures of what about the stranded assets, very much our topic today about transition. If we put that sort of stamp duty sliding scale in, you will end up with some homes that just cannot be retrofitted. So we need some additional measures to tackle that issue. And then, as you said, lots of ingenuity and creativity that we could pursue around green rental agreements, where you share the energy savings between the landlord and the tenant, because that split incentive is currently quoted quite a lot as one of the barriers for landlords, particularly in the private sector, to retrofit. Green Deal got mentioned, and I can see it's in the Q&A as well. If I got a pound for every time someone told me, you know, the Green Deal is something that should sort of stop because it wasn't successful the first time round, I could obviously retire. But you know, there are key lessons that we can take from the Green Deal, and also from what we've seen work in other jurisdictions. I keep mentioning the American Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, which has managed to mobilize over $5 billion of institutional capital into retrofitting homes by effectively putting a property first lien on properties rather than on property owners, and then using those cash flows that flow back to the municipal authorities to securitize and then issue bonds on the back of them. There are lots of suggestions out there. They all need to be looked at in the round. I think that's my key message, is sadly, despite all the work that's been done in this space over many, many years, there isn't one single lever. And for us to drive systemic change, we are actually having to look at a portfolio of measures which are granular and which it's going to require a lot of collaboration and a lot of hard work. But I'm very optimistic that the solutions are out there and the ingenuity is out there. We just need to try and motivate sort of the many people we've got on this call today, for example, to actually start using their finance expertise and their creativity on this agenda.
Great, thanks very much. We are actually coming up to the hour, so we have very little time. The great set of questions. I think one is, I think a lot of people are very enthusiastic about the agenda, but I think a number of concerns about some of the tricky issues we're going to have to address. How do we address issues around the aviation sector? This issue about sort of adjusting financing costs, how that could work, questions about metrics, actually from the EIB, about what sort of socially inclusive metrics. But I just wondered really if the panelists really would like to have a sort of closing thoughts. We had a nice, very optimistic question in actually saying how do we sort of create, how do we move forward and creative that is itself that blooms, which is positive, and overcome some of the tension. Really, just from the panelists, you're sort of about the sort of how we would take this forward. Maybe start with you again, just your sort of one sort of big idea to take it forward. Thank you.
Sorry, Nick, who did you say?
I went back to Bob, actually. Sorry, to Bob.
Okay.
If you want to give
thanks, Nick. Yeah. Well, I think our job as the Trade Association is to encourage our members to embrace the findings of this report and put in place the leadership and enabling framework, as we call it, to support a just transition. It's then for members within their own business models to find, the particular angles which suit the way they do business. And we've already seen, HSBC committing to provide and facilitate 100 billion of sustainable financing by 2025. We've got Lloyd's committed to reducing carbon emissions that it finances by more than 50% by 2030. NatWest to halve the climate change impact of its financing activities by 2030. Santander and Barclays making very similar undertakings. I think our job is to encourage the whole sector to embrace the just transition, work within the framework that is established by this report, but they must come up with their own particular angles that fit their business models. It's not for us to dictate that.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Bob. And again, thanks again for your partnership in the project. It's been,
thank you for an excellent piece of work.
Yeah. Sophia, just I mean, there's many things here, but I mean, where do you focus your attention?
So, I mean, my recommendation would be to go back to the three pillars. So, and this is in a way of answering the question around metrics and also, policy and everything. So I think the thing that was really interesting to me was to really think about, is something inclusive? Does it promote the inclusion agenda? Does it promote a regional equality and really help regional regeneration? And is it sufficiently sector specific? That to me was a game changer, because immediately you can start thinking about, from a financial sector perspective, if you're an equity lender or debt lender, you can be thinking, have we got the data? Who are we lending it to? Where are they? Are we actually... and then you can start to differentiate metrics underneath that. And I think that the key thing is we do need more data about that in order to answer the question about whether we are lending or providing equity in a way that is actually promoting this agenda. And that is a really helpful way, I think, of looking at this, because it begins to allow you to disaggregate and to think more critically about what it is you're attempting to achieve and then develop some metrics underneath that. So I hope that that is something that people find helpful when they read the report as a takeaway.
Very good, and I think in the you'll have the link to the report, which is up on the site. Hopefully, an easy read for you to follow. So, Teresa, your sort of thought on sort of what next, what we should do on Monday to take forward this agenda.
I think it's around the messaging. We need to understand how vital SMEs to the UK. I think we all understand that. I think we need to work together to help them out of today's gloom, and we need the messaging to get the messaging right to help them realise with a compelling case that green is good for business and there's no time to waste. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks for the and Marie, your sort of closing thoughts about how we take this forward.
In the dying seconds, I'm going to throw two big ideas onto the table. One is a green sovereign bond for the UK, one that we can do that focuses on climate, but obviously has the just transition element of looking at the social aspects as well. A real opportunity for us to show leadership on the global stage in the run-up to COP26 by doing something that is that shows some initiative on actually building in the social aspects post-COVID as well. And the second one is answering one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A box, the need for us to introduce a carbon tax, a genuine sector focused carbon charge that I think from a banking perspective could be particularly useful in building out some of that scenario analysis that we all need to see of how the leaders and laggards are going to be impacted going forward. And then just a final comment from me to congratulate all the authors of the report for this just transition work. It's very timely. It's a fantastic piece of work, and looking forward very much to supporting you all as you try and put some of this into practice.
Well, thanks, Marie, and thanks for throwing in some big ideas. Yes, I mean, I think this idea of a green sovereign bond, linking the sort of the green agenda with the social aspects is a great opportunity for the UK, and carbon tax as well. I mean, in the report we do talk about again how sort of we can move on to the next generation of carbon taxes, where particularly we use the revenues to particularly deal with some of the sort of social issues that might have arisen in the past, and we don't get Gilets Jaunes response that happened in France. So thanks again to the panelists, fantastic ideas. Thanks to all of you on the audience. Really good questions. Apologies we haven't answered all of them. Please have a look at the report. As I said earlier, we'll have briefings on the SME and on the housing themes next week. Please get in touch with us if you'd like to take this agenda forward. So thanks again to the panelists, and good morning to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Excellent.